And we're back. This is now episode 2 of the Assignment of Benefits podcast. And I'm very happy to have Werner Kruck join me, who I've known for a few years and is taking on some quite an interesting project. So we're going to get into that in this particular episode. Werner, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here. The first podcast I ever did was, I guess maybe 2018
Yep,
with you. Yep, you and
yep,
Wes.
yep, exactly. So we've known each other for a little while, and it was good to kind of reconnect and learn about this particular project, which I think from, as we discussed, from a Florida standpoint, it could be the thing that we need. But before we jump into that, I'm going to allow you a little bit of time to give an elevator pitch. Werner, can you give us a little bit of your background, history, and what you're currently doing?
Well, my background is I spent about 45 years working for the insurance company side. Product was where I started. Product, in order to develop it, you need a lot of data. So it got me into data and technology. So the fusion of product data and technology is kind of where I had my emphasis. I was I worked for Security First Insurance Company
Hmm.
about 15 years from 2006 through January of 2020. We grew from a startup to one of the largest homeowner companies in Florida, and I was chief operating officer. Since leaving them, I was doing some consulting for a bunch of different organizations, which was very interesting. And then the opportunity came up, and I joined AAIS as president and CEO this past June. And that's something I'm very excited about. I've worked with AAIS forms and AAIS as an organization for the past 30 years, and I've been on the board of AAIS since 2017. So it's an organization I'm familiar with and an organization that I'm just thrilled to be a part of.
Just in case anyone doesn't know AAIS, can you give, it's in your background, so there are the letters. Can you, what do the letters stand for? And perhaps give any audience member that is not aware of what AAIS does, what's your value proposition?
So it stands for the American Association of Insurance Services, AAIS. We are a rating and advisory organization, and that is something that's created by statute. And so that as an entity, we have the statutory authority to combine data from many companies in order to promulgate loss costs, which turn into rates, rules, and we write policy forms. We file these with the state insurance departments, and our member companies can adopt them, which speeds to market, so they don't have to write their own policies and they don't have to necessarily create their own rates. So our fundamental product service is policy forms, loss costs for rating and rules. We are interesting or unique in that we are not for profit. We're actually owned by over 300 member insurance groups, insurance companies, and so that gives us a unique position in our industry where we can facilitate and advocate for improvements to the insurance business that have the requirement that competitors work together and collaborate.
So AAIS has been around for quite a few years, and I think the part of the importance is you are member driven. So you're basically owned by, is it owned by the insurance companies or they just considered members?
No, we're owned by them.
Yeah. And so they're contributing data for you to aggregate to let them set a better rate, or have a better rating structure, have a more unified form structure, forms that have, kind of pass muster with court systems and regulatory bodies. It alleviates a lot of overhead for your member companies.
Yes, it does. And also the thing that we do is it's not only create them, but maintain them. There's a lot of legislation and regulatory changes that happen in states every year. We monitor them as they develop. And then once they're the ones that are actually enacted, if they require changes to policy forms and rating plans, then we do that so our members can adopt them and stay in compliance.
Yeah, it alleviates part of the burden of individual in organizations needing to become expert at the 50 plus state regulatory bodies, right? Like that would actually be like a duplication of work across all of your member companies. And for the most part, it's actually better to aggregate it. They'll actually have better information, better rates, and the forms themselves will having a uniform structure makes it a little bit easier to make sure you don't stumble into unforeseen territory with the courts, right?
Well, there's a lot of benefits actually to the industry. Now, some large companies choose to have their own forms.
Yep.
Some use the forms of another rating organization. There's a few, but the rating organizations take the burden off regulators too, because if every company filed a separate policy form, it's tough. It takes a lot of work on the part of the regulators to make sure that forms and form changes are compliant with their state statutes. And so it also helps agents because the agents can't read every policy form. And if there's a large variety in the policy forms that are out there, that makes it tough for the agents. So the
Yeah.
rating organizations really do contribute to an efficient process. And certainly if you're a company that's just getting into business or adding a new line, the ability to sort of take a product off the shelf is a real advantage.
Yeah, and the regulatory bodies are already struggling with the volume that they're
Mm.
facing now. Imagine multiplying that by 2, 3, 4, 10. That'd be really difficult to work with. So we got that out of the way, but I think the topic of this particular conversation is a project that you are a driving force in called openIDL. And I want to spend the remainder of this particular episode talking about openIDL and the value that it's going to bring. So we'll start we'll start right from brass tacks around what is openIDL. Can you give us a little background around what it is and what your involvement in it is?
Well, openIDL is something that we created at AAIS about 5 years ago. And we created it with a vision that we could do a better job as an industry in sharing data. We share a lot of data as an industry. More data is passed back and forth between insurance entities and stakeholders, either through APIs, but a lot of them are files and data is stored from one company on another company's server. So it's an inefficient process. So we had this idea. We built it and we realized that we probably couldn't afford to, with our size, to continue to build it and maintain it. So we donated it to the Linux Foundation. And so openIDL is a corporation, a not-for-profit corporation under the not-for-profit Linux Foundation who runs it. And there's a board of directors that has some of our member companies on it. We have a seat on it, and regulators could join for free. So at the board process with its committees that run openIDL is an open forum for participation by the insurance industry. So that begs the question is what is openIDL? And at its heart, instead of doing an extract and sending a file to somebody, like a data call to a regulator, each company would create a node. In other words, you store your data in that format. So if instead of sending the file, you updated the node, you just put the data in your own node, which you control, then you would have your data there and you control it, but everybody has it in the same format. So the openIDL platform has the ability for instance, for a regulator to query all of the companies that they want to do a data call in for electronically instead of sending out the notices by email that they do today and get responses back, yes, no, or a comment, and to quickly figure out a data call format that everybody agrees on. Then they can execute it simultaneously and the data is taken out from each one of the nodes. It's aggregated. It's anonymized. So one of the issues that companies have is if you send a data file for a data call, that they know that's your data. Okay, so it can be identified. It can have PII on it. It's now outside your data security, and it could be used for reasons other than what you were asked for it by either them or somebody that steals it. So it's not a secure way to share data. So with openIDL, all that data before it goes to the regulator is anonymized and packaged, and it can be a very fast process. But the data stays under the control of the insurance company, and they have, give permission. And then for the regulators, they have the ability to pull up the data already, because when they get a data call and they get a whole bunch of files, they got to pull that all together. They got to correct it. They got to anonymize it themselves. A lot of work. So it takes all the friction out of that. And so that's sort of what it does. There's technology underlying it, and you can do the same thing in a lot of different ways technically. And in AAIS, we made kind of we focused too much on the technology, which got us off the course of really saying, let's facilitate a better discussion of the problem we're trying to solve. And then we're flexible on the technology. We want technology that everybody can use. We want technology that doesn't require someone to pay for proprietary software. So we want an open source platform on the network. What people want to use behind the platform is up to them. So we want to build a technology to solve the problem, not try to address the problem by building the technology.
Yeah. And there's a lot to unpack there. So let's unpack that. Okay. So one, we had this conversation at the Florida Chamber Insurance Summit. Technology and data are supposed to solve a lot of the insurance problems. And I think technology has made things worse because it's taken a bad underlying data structure and scaled that. It's scaled junk. And so now we just have more junk. And I had not even thought about the opposite stakeholder on the other side, the regulators who have to do multiple calls, multiple absorptions of data, multiple cleanses to anonymize. Wow. So it goes in both directions. It's data that the insurance companies are accumulating. They have to pass it along in one particular direction. I'm sure there is a format to it, but then there's work by the entity on the receiving end as well. So there's a lot of work on the front end, a lot of work on the back end, and a lot of lost value because, as we discussed, the data calls are now intensive. And so
Yes.
it's not that the data is not there. It's like, okay, we have to request something in a particular format. Now it's going to get sent to us. Now we have to clean it up. So let's not ask for too much because we're just asking for more work and nobody wants that. So openIDL potentially can reduce friction for all of the parties, all of the stakeholders in this, and really facilitate smooth data calls while solving for the concerns of the individual parties, which for the insurance companies, it's the, anonymity,
I have
English
trouble with
Nick,
that one too.
anonymity of the data. And for the regulators, it's getting what they need in a speedy fashion and ready to go without having to, that multiple data call thing or multiple call outs seems annoying. To do it in one query, one push seems like it solves so many issues for both sides of the stakeholders, which I'm assuming that's the design of it.
Right. If you're going to do a data call, you're going to have, if you're an insurance company, you have a data call, you're going to have to do a query. Why not do one query all the time and just keep it updated that's big enough so that you could do subqueries on it if you. Other issue that at the heart of this issue is not only the eliminating the friction, eliminating the security risk of data, but making typically a data call is set up because, well, I had one insurance deputy commissioner just tell me one time, he says, this is how it works. So there's an issue in the legislature. The governor calls the insurance commissioner and says, we need data. We have a decision to make, and we need to know what the dimensions are. So the insurance commissioner says, all right, let's do a data call. The problem is that rarely is the data call finished with information that's helpful before the legislatures have to make a decision anyway. So what typically happens is, the legislators, the lobbyists and everybody are all they're all arguing, but nobody has the complete data or really good data. And so they make whatever decision they're going to make. And then naturally the insurance industry comes out and says, well, that's really a bonehead, legislation. And their response is, well, yeah, but we asked you for data and you didn't have any, and we did the best we could. We had to address the problem. And I think that, the regulators are frustrated. The insurance companies should be concerned as well, because I think that if we had better data early on in Florida, we would have taken so long, and the industry would have lost so many billions of dollars before we could have had correction.
Yeah. I mean, it's in my conversation with Wesley Todd, the AoB thing was known for a while. Like you could see it coming, and I think Case Glide, as an example, had access to or was privy to sources of litigation data where it was really being spelled out, and that's a challenge for the industry. I'm also thinking, Werner, of having done lots of queries in my analytical work, sometimes the thing that I want, once I get it, I realize, oh, that's not actually the thing that I want. Like I need a twist to it. Like it's bringing back too much information. I need to filter it down, or it didn't bring back the right one. And so I suspect with an openIDL process that can be fixed quickly. So you can get permission to run a query, and then if you decide, hey, we're like a column off, right? Like
Right.
we chose the wrong column. We have to rerun this query. It can be rerun without having to then execute an entire data call process. It's
Right.
just basically pushing a button, right?
Right. Essentially, what also happens, and I've spent a lot of time with looking at data, is that you pull you're looking for something, you have some thought and process. That's what drives what you ask for, what you analyze. But then as you sort through the data, you go, oh, that's interesting. I wonder if I could see this, and then you want to add another dimension, because you see some correlation or potential correlation that you would have known until you looked at the data. So you don't know. It's an exploration many times.
Yeah, completely. And how is there a possibility of using openIDL even in front of the carrier stakeholders? Like, is it possible that data could arrive to the carriers already in an openIDL format, which would also make it easier for them to facilitate and process data?
Well, it's a good question, but the way that the data is structured in our industry, it depends on the policy administration system. So the first time a quote is, created and then a policy is issued, the data fields, what we call a data model architecture. That's what are the fields, each field called, and how are they defined? Is it an integer? Is it a complex number? Is it a string? And what do they mean? And what are valid entries to them? That data model architecture is a component of every policy administration system. At the heart of the data problem is the fact that every policy administration system has a different data model. So it's like we're all speaking a slightly different language.
Mm-hmm.
But when you want to share data, you have to convert it to a standard format. And when regulators issue a data call, they're creating another format. They're not using a standard format. So one of the byproducts and one of the pieces that's important about a platform like openIDL with its open governance is a byproduct of the process is a open source data model architecture for the insurance industry. And that is a really big deal. There is something similar to that in the UK called Polaris, because the UK has a much more interwoven insurance between platforms, rating. They have a little bit of a different system, a bigger need for interconnectivity, but they all use the same data model architecture, and that makes a big difference. So without the single data model architecture, so the reason that policy administration systems all use their own is there are only two data model architectures for P&C insurance that I know about that are actually data model architectures. One is Accord and one is IBM. But if you're a policy administration system builder, if you adopt either one of those, you have to pay for them. So you'd have to pay to use them for every single client or installation that you used it for. So it's a cost structure, and it's simpler to create your own. If we had an open source data model architecture, people would start to adapt it, and you wouldn't have this problem of how do you convert from one architecture to another every time you want to share data.
Yeah, and I was going to bring up Accord as an example of standardization that has been attempted. What do we say to insurance execs, senior ones that have been around for a while? That's like, Werner, we've tried this before. We've tried standardizing. What's different this time?
Well, this time there's a couple things. One is, Accord was really established to do that, and it had to generate revenue in order to build it. In this particular case, if you like openIDL, the data model architecture is actually a byproduct. It's not the product. It's a byproduct. The other thing is that the insurance industry our data's gotten more and more complex. And the cost of not being able to freely exchange data and it's a hidden cost. It's a hidden cost in terms of manpower, computing power, lost opportunities, and difficult transitions.
Yeah.
Imagine it's not just sharing data. It's a problem if you want to move from one policy administration system to another. You have to map all your data from one data model architecture to another. Imagine if they are on the same data model architecture. That process would be greatly enhanced.
Yeah. Can you talk about the advantages of open source? And because you just really landed on something, which is how do we, systems are going to evolve. Data is getting more complex. So what's to say that this initiative won't be able to keep up with it? Can you talk about open source and the value that open source brings to that specific objection that someone might have?
Well, the Linux Foundation, it's a credible organization. When you take a look at the benefits of open source software and collaboration across, starting with the Linux desktop, but now, most of the world's websites are on Apache, which is a Linux Foundation. Linux Foundation and open source software, big companies are members, and they've built vast systems on open source software. So that's been proven to be a viable way to develop. I think the difference here is what's good about open source is you get away from having to argue about proprietary software. If you want universal adoption, but you don't have an open source model, then you're not going to get universal adoption. People are going to say, well, this is too expensive, or I don't like any of the alternatives. But if it's free and open source, or if it's built in, that's important. The second thing that's important is when you adopt something, if it's proprietary software, you're kind of caught. In other words, once everybody's all in, the switching costs get high, and the proprietary software companies can raise their price because they want to find that highest price that you'll pay without saying, okay, I'm going to switch. And that's been a hallmark. That's been one of the things that's caused our industry to be divisive. We've allowed vendors to kind of build switching costs in as a way to protect themselves. And what's happening with technology, it's not just our industry, is that open source platforms and platforms and networks, companies and industry want to have options. And there are areas we can work together to make that more effective.
Yeah, and firms that are eager to extract more value out of it can participate more. Like they would have the ability to persuade and influence the direction of it if they felt that strongly about it. I know there's governance all around it, but I think there would be some firms that would sort of sit back and say, okay, we'll just take the standardization and we won't have the cost. But I think there would be other firms that would be like, well, we're different and we want to make sure that these elements are incorporated in because those elements are important for us as well. So companies could kind of, I don't want to say take it or leave it, but they have the option of deciding how much they want to engage with open source, but they have the opportunity to influence the future direction of it. Whereas in other standardization models, they can ask, but they may not have the influence because they're basically just the customer.
Right. And we can't build something that becomes a platform for the entire industry, something that's proprietary. I don't think it doesn't make sense, but I don't think it's workable. With the openIDL governance, any insurance company can become a member of openIDL and have a board seat at certain level, or you can just become a member, and you can have your people volunteer to work on the data governance parts, building the data model architecture, product line by product line. So there's opportunity to be involved, to see it, and to like you say, be a part of the direction, or say I'm just along for the ride and I'll take the benefits.
Yeah. And now I'm thinking of as well, like I guess when you work on this exercise, you can keep coming up with stakeholders that could benefit from this. Insurers do have the issue of having to create bordereau statements. So not just regulators that have data calls. And in fact, the bordereau statement is a data call. It's a structured data call and it's a regular one, but it's still a data call. And so I can imagine carriers with multiple reinsurers having everything structured in a particular way makes it easier for both of those parties to engage with one another, right?
Well, actually, yes, but it's even more complicated than that, because in most cases you have a reinsurance broker sitting between the ceding company and the reinsurer, and so you're passing files and data to the broker, who's trying to reorganize them and pass them back to the reinsurer, which is getting now the reinsurer, when they get their files, they're getting files from a lot of ceding companies and from multi-brokers, and they want to have a unified view of what they're doing, and they're getting different file formats. I mean, when you start to look at the ultimate benefits of a unified platform and a single data model architecture in our industry, it affects every stakeholder.
Yeah, I was going through this sort of exercise, Werner, with a startup that was working on cleaning up statements of value for commercial insurers. And we estimated that the problem might be in the billions of work redundancy, right? So data that's coming in that needs to be cleansed and scrubbed, put into a catastrophe model, then pulled out. It's like all of these firms are all hiring data scrubbers. But at the end of the day, they're all getting standardized to one, two, three different models. And so we have redundancies all throughout the system. And for firms, this is a significant overhead expense where if we could standardize it it would eliminate some of that expense as well. So both the cleansing and the reporting back out, it creates really strong economies of scale. We haven't even mentioned the trade associations, right? So that could be for specifically for the carriers, but it could also be the regulate the the NAIC for the regulators. They're going to have particular needs as well. It's going to be slightly different than what the specific states are looking for. Can you go into that a little bit?
Well, the NAIC really exists to help the states execute. So theoretically, the NAIC shouldn't have any needs that vary from those of their members, which are the state insurance commissioners. So I see them as pretty much one stakeholder
Yeah.
block. And theoretically, too, the trade associations for insurers should reflect the concerns of their members as well. So they're not different. They're just, in both cases, that's a place for insurers, if collectively they are concerned about something, that they can act in concert. And again, not be more effective acting as a group rather than acting individually.
Yeah. Let's bring it around to Florida in particular and why openIDL in Florida could be a very unique issue in that we have lots of data calls. We're a highly catastrophe prone state, right? And generally after every catastrophe, there are extra data calls that are required as the regulators want to see, okay, are you meeting your requirements, your burden? Are you dealing in good faith? But then there are issues around climate change, which is a topic that just came up, right? Like now the federal government is peeking in as well. And so Florida is going to be ground zero for a lot of that activity, voluntarily or involuntarily. And I'm particularly concerned about the involuntary one where there's a request from another outside stakeholder to the state of Florida, which the courts say you have to abide by. And then what do? Now we need another data scrub, another data call, another data scrub, and now we have multiple layers of stakeholders that need access to it. And the standardization, it's almost like a ripple effect, Werner. And it's almost like the standardization as our industry gets more complex, creates more efficiencies, more value for the stakeholders to follow that particular standard. Can you talk a little bit about like the uniqueness of Florida and how the stakeholders in Florida, all of them would benefit greatly from standardization?
Well, we have had our struggles with litigation. We have our struggles with catastrophes. We have our struggles with reinsurance. Our insurance, our property insurance in Florida is heavily dependent on reinsurers and heavily subject to regulation. And both reinsurers and regulators need data. Our data complexity, for instance, for homeowners or property, is way more complex than it was when I started in the business, and it's not getting any simpler. As an insurance company, when you're analyzing your data, you're analyzing it in a lot of complexity and a lot of detail, but that detail and complexity is not necessarily available to your reinsurers and to your regulators. And so, and the cost of getting the data that we do provide to the regulators is quite high. We have a bunch of different data calls in Florida and different regular reporting that all could be done off a single platform. But more important than that, there's a couple things about Florida that are different. The adoption of a industry-wide platform will take some time, no matter what we do. And part of the problem is that you have to get the big companies to go first. So, you've got to get all the biggies. But a high percentage of the homeowners business and property business in Florida is written by companies that are in Florida. So you could start with all the smaller companies or all the companies that are in Florida and say, hey, we want you on this platform. Let's start with homeowners. and you would have critical mass. You'd have excellent data because you throw in citizens and the Florida domestic companies, domicile companies, you've got critical mass. Then you could actually understand what's going on in Florida. How much is climate? You're not going to solve climate change in the insurance business. You're going to react to it, but the reaction to it could be used as a measure. And we're very inefficient in our response. I mean, one of the things that happens in a catastrophe is FEMA it has to understand before they can give aid, grant aid to people, they got to understand if they have insurance or not. Well, that's a time-consuming process. There are all sorts of processes that we have to go through that ripple through the insurance world. And if we could take one area that needs information the most, that has basically the opportunity, the best opportunity to address it, I would say it would be Florida property. And I think too, there may be a case. The special session a year ago did a lot to correct a lot of problems that were causing the property insurance to sort of the companies to die and causing the problems in availability and reinsurance. But I think some people think that it may have gone too far because it sounded like everything for the insurance industry and nothing for the consumer. They put some things in claims, which may be helpful, but it might be time for all of us in Florida to get together and figure out a way not to let the next crisis happen in a vacuum of information so that we can't react to it.
Yeah. In terms of openIDL and stakeholders who would get access to it, as you were talking about that, I was thinking of the possibility, since the data's there and the data's anonymized, is there a possibility of having like research firms or consulting firms, maybe even academic institutions who could get access to it? Because I'm thinking, wouldn't it be interesting to have it, we'll call them impartial stakeholders who can do research and conduct business intelligence, create a business intelligence layer over the anonymized data and essentially tell us in quasi real time, hey, this is what's happening. Or after 6 months of these reforms, this is what we're seeing. It seems like the amount of work and research that's required to tell us if the reforms are working or not is onerous. Would there be room for other stakeholders like academics, researchers, consulting firms to come in and act as impartial third parties to create layers of business intelligence?
That's possible. In fact, I would argue that if you gave, a university, for example, Florida State's got an insurance school, if
Yeah.
they were to do a study on the data, if somebody impartial were to reach the same conclusions that the industry has, I think more credible. Because whatever we say as an industry, everybody says, well, you're going to say that because that's the argument you want to, you're going to show us the data that supports your argument. But, there's not a huge amount of trust in the insurance industry in that regard. But a third party independently with no axe to grind says, well, look, this is what's happening. I think that would be very positive.
Yeah.
Now, bear in mind that any type of platform like that would require, the insurance industries to consent to provide that data. There is still consent, but I think it would be, I think it would be difficult to say no to qualified people because it almost say, well, I don't want you to understand the data. And I think we all want to
Yeah.
understand what's happening.
And openIDL has reduced the risk by anonymizing the data. So it's not
Right.
like any individual firm is vulnerable, right, to exposure they don't want.
Right.
It's not
Right.
That's not possible because the data is anonymized. So you've almost like greased the skids to encourage those third party firms to come in. And I think this is like a fantastic way to end this particular episode, because when we started talking about openIDL, it was like technology and data were supposed to solve the problem. Are like the more data you get, the more efficient or effective your decision making should be. and insurance has really struggled with that. What got me excited about my conversation with you with openIDL was given given the evolution of technology. Finally, the technology is here to create this kind of open source standard that we probably didn't have before. And finally, once the data gets standardized, we can now make decisions faster, more efficiently, and it benefits multiple stakeholders and not just one particular silo. Seems like a fantastic way to end, Werner, on a positive note around, like you said,
No.
data. The data is getting more complex, and there's now technology that can help manage that.
And if we all cooperate, all the stakeholders, it'll be better for all the stakeholders. It'll be better for society. We have an obligation to the society that we're a part of to make it better. And I think the number one reason to participate is not all the things we've talked about. I think the number one reason to participate is because it's the right thing to do. That's where I start. And that's kind of where I finish.
Yeah, great way to finish. So, Werner, thank you. For everyone that's listening, the show notes will have all of the contact information. I plan on discussing openIDL in content form in one fashion or another. And Werner, of course, we will have not only you back on, but members of openIDL, because I want to open the kimono, so to speak. This is just an introductory to openIDL, but I think it's probably behooves the state of Florida and advocacy for insurance to examine it more so we can increase the credibility of the platform. People can have their objections relieved, so to speak.
But I would clarify, maybe openIDL is not the solution. Okay, we think it is, but what's more important is that we start having the conversation that we have to do something different. And openIDL is an example, and say, okay, here's the benefits. If you got something better, then it should be better. If we have to change it to make it better, we can do that. But let's talk about the problem. Let's agree on what we have to accomplish, and then let's work together to get done.
Yep. I like that approach. So, Werner, happy Friday. Thank you so much for discussing openIDL. And again, back to the audience, there'll be a lot more about this in the future. But Werner, thank you.
Thank you, Nick. It's always a pleasure. Great to see you.
Same.
Thank you.